saved. And what we see in these, and one thing that in talking to somebody that you might be witnessing to, whether they're on the religious extreme or on the immoral extreme, or anywhere in between, you can go to John chapter 3 and John chapter 4, and you can show that, look, this religious guy needed to be saved, and this wicked woman needed to be saved, and that Jesus was willing to save them both. It doesn't matter how bad you've been. It doesn't matter how good you've been from man's economy. It just matters whether or not you've gotten saved. And so whether you need living water or to be born again, both synonyms for the same thing, that Jesus is the only answer to that. So John 3, John 4 is a great soul-winning, those are two great soul-winning passages that you can use when somebody is maybe questioning whether they really need to be saved because they think they're so good, or whether they think they're too bad for God to want. These are passages that answer a lot of questions and encompass a lot of people who think maybe salvation's not for them for one reason or another. So John chapter 4 says, "When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John," notice this, "though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples." Okay. As far as we know, Jesus never baptized anybody. His disciples did the baptizing. And probably because Jesus knew that whoever he baptized would think they were better than somebody baptized by John or Peter or somebody like that. So he just didn't do the baptizing. His disciples did. Verse 3, "He left Judea and departed again into Galilee." So they're down in Judea. They went out to, at the end of chapter 3, they went out to the area of Jordan near where John was baptizing. And he was baptizing, and John was a little bit away, and he was baptizing, but more people were coming to see Jesus than they were coming to see John the Baptist. And, people asked John about that as if he was supposed to be jealous about that. And, of course, John said, "He must increase, I must decrease." And there was no jealousy in that conversation at all. It just dawned on me. I had that happen last week. I hadn't muted my phone. And sure enough, the one time I didn't mute my phone last week, somebody texted me right in the middle of service. So, verse 3 again tells us he's going from Judea up into Galilee. So he's going from the south near Jerusalem, down in that area. He's going up north into Galilee and probably around the Sea of Galilee, one of the many towns he ministered in there. And that takes him on a journey that typically the Jewish people would cross the Jordan River, go up the east side of the Jordan River, and cross back over to avoid having to go through Samaria. The Samaritan people were half Jewish, half Gentile. They originated with the Assyrian captivity that took place around 700 BC. The Assyrian Empire took the northern tribes into captivity, and one of the Assyrian methods for maintaining control over a large kingdom was to mix the population so that they could not have a national identity. So he deported very much of the Jewish people out of the northern territories, and he imported people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire. And so the remaining Jewish people began to intermarry with the Gentiles that were imported, and now they have lost their Jewish identity. These people in the rebuilding era under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah were very hostile towards the Jewish people and their attempt to rebuild the temple and the walls and the gates and all of that in that rebuilding period. And even during the silent years, there were multiple incursions. It was a very unstable time between the Old Testament and the New Testament in Israel, and the Samaritans always sided with Israel's enemies in those. And so if you were a Jewish person, the true Jews, the way they saw it, I'm using air quotes here, the true Jews lived in Judea around Jerusalem, and the more moderate Jews lived in Galilee. That's not me saying that. That's their mindset about it. If you're from Galilee, you're not as important a Jewish person as somebody from Judea. That was just their mindset. If you go to Israel today, The Orthodox Jews tend to live near Jerusalem, and the secular Jewish people live in Tel Aviv and around Tel Aviv. You go to Tel Aviv, and you would think you're in New York City or Miami or anywhere else. You go to Jerusalem, and there's no question you're in a religious city. Everybody's either dressed in the Orthodox Jewish garb or in Muslim garb, or you're an American tourist. But everybody is, you see Catholic priests and Orthodox priests, and you see imams and clerics and all of that walking around, and everybody's wearing their religious attire. There's no question. And the only people not wearing religious attire generally are either the shopkeepers or the tourists. But you go to Tel Aviv, and you see almost none of the religious attire at all. And so it's just kind of the mindset that if you're from Judea, if you're in Judea, that's where the temple is. That makes you closer to God than if you live up in Galilee. But in between Judea in the south and Galilee in the north, there's this area called Samaria. There's a city named Samaria, but there's also the region of Samaria. And this is a place where your enemies lived. If you're a Jewish person, these people have sided against you. They've been a thorn in your side. They're not really Jewish. They don't worship God the way you do. They don't come to the temple and offer sacrifices. They're half-breeds in the mindset of the Jewish people. And so the Jewish people and the Samaritans avoided each other at all costs, despite the fact that the Samaritans were smack dab in the middle of two Jewish regions. The Galilee in the north and Judea in the south. And so they would cross over the Jordan River, go up the other side, and cross back over just to avoid contact with the Samaritan people. So when Jesus decides to go from Judea up to Galilee, and they were in the region of Jordan, so they were already by the Jordan River, the disciples would have expected Jesus to make a right-hand turn, go across the Jordan River, and go up. Instead, Jesus makes a left-hand turn, and he starts going right smack dab through the middle of Samaria. So verse 4, it says, he must needs go through Samaria. It wasn't just that Jesus felt the urge to see what Samaria looked like, or he just felt the urge to go provoke some Samaritan people. No, he had a need for going there. Jesus never did anything in a haphazard fashion. He never did anything on a whim. Jesus did everything in a very deliberate fashion, and there was a reason for going to Samaria. Verse 5, then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar. Now, Sychar, again, is smack dab right in the middle of Samaria. It's not along the Jordan River. It's not out by the seacoast. It is smack dab right in the middle between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Jesus aimed him and his disciples right through the heart of Samaria. He didn't just skirt it. He went right down the middle. And so verse 5 finishes with, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well. Now, this was the place where Jacob had dug a well. This is a place where the Jewish people had a history there. And right now, there's a church over the traditional spot of Jacob's well. There is a well there. It's extraordinarily deep. I think it's over 200 feet deep, this well is. But it still produces water today. And it's still a place that you could go to, and you could potentially see that. Is that Jacob's well? Can't say for certain. He didn't write, Jacob was here is not scratched on the side. So it's you can't be absolutely sure, but it fits all of the parameters. It's in what was known as Sychar. It's a well that's been there, and there's records of this well being there for thousands of years. So it is the best candidate we have for it. You could go see it today if you wanted to. Verse 6 says, now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. What time is the 6th hour on our clock? Noon. Jewish day starts around 6 a.m. It starts at daylight, and so they divide the day between daylight and night. That's how they think of their day, and so the 6th hour of the day period not the way we think of it, not a calendar day, but the daylight period is about noon. So about 6 a.m. is when the day starts, about the 6 hours about noon, and the 12th hour would be about 6 p.m., and that would begin the first watch of the night. And that's kind of an average. Verse 7, there cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. So there's a lot of weird stuff happening in one little verse here in verse 7. Jesus is there at noon. Nobody comes to draw their water at noon. It's hot. It's too hot. The women go out. Usually they get up in the morning, and the first thing that they would do is they would go to the well, and they would draw water that they would need for cooking and washing if they didn't have a creek or running water or anything like that. They would go draw whatever they needed for their morning and daytime stuff, and then in the evening they would go draw again. So they had water in the end of the evening for cooking, washing, that kind of stuff in preparation to go to sleep, and to leave a little water in the house overnight. So you got thirsty, you didn't have to walk a mile to the well, you could just go get a glass of water. And so this is noon. This is not the time when the women went to the well. It's also traditional that the women would go in groups because they could carry more rather than each woman just going by herself. The women would often go together, and they would talk as they walked, like women often like to do. They would talk, and they would share each other's burdens and loads, and they would help each other take the stone off the well and all of that. So this woman is by herself in the middle of the day. This is extraordinarily unusual, and yet Jesus is just sitting there waiting for her. It's kind of like he already knew that she was coming. Verse 8, for his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. So, they were traveling. They didn't have food, and so Jesus sends his disciples into this Samaritan town to go buy food, which I'm sure they were thrilled about, having to do business with Samaritans. They were probably going to get ripped off, because the Samaritans were not about to give them a deal. So they probably were going in there to pay top dollar, and they were probably going to be rather annoyed at the contact they would have with these Samaritan people. And so Jesus is sitting there by himself. Verse 9, then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. So here is a statement of fact. The Jews and the Samaritans don't have dealings together. The fact that Jesus is asking this woman for a drink, for a man to ask a woman who's coming to the well to draw water to draw some for him is not that unusual. The fact that he's Jewish and she's Samaritan and he's asking her is. The prejudice was more extreme in Jesus' period. The prejudice between the two was more extreme than in the pre-civil rights South in America between black and white. The KKK, they were nasty and vicious and wicked and all that. But the hatred between the Jewish and the Samaritan people exceeded that. It would be akin to the Hamas and the Jewish people today. She is despised by any Jewish person, and Jesus here is actually talking to her and being polite, asking her for something to drink. He's not cursing at her. He's not shaming her. He just asked for a drink, and that in and of itself is unusual. That's why she answers the way she does. Verse 10, Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou would have asked of him that he would have given thee living water. Jesus says, Give me to drink. She says, Why are you asking me? Jews and Samaritans don't talk to each other. And Jesus said, Actually, if you knew who was asking, you would ask me for living water rather than me asking you. And so he immediately, just like he did with Nicodemus, he takes the conversation from something that is temporal and physical to something that is eternal and spiritual. Nicodemus comes, says, we know you're a man sent from God. We know that you can't do these miracles except God be with you. And Jesus immediately says, well, except you're born again, you can't see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus is like, what are we talking about here? How can you go back in your mother's womb? Jesus immediately switched over to the spiritual and his need for salvation. Here Jesus does the same thing with her. Give me something to drink. Well, why are you asking me? You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan. Jesus said, no, wait a minute. You don't even understand that who you're talking to here. If you understood who you're talking to, you'd be asking me for living water. Now, living water is not this term living water wouldn't have been a unique phrase to her. This wouldn't have been something like, just like born again, okay, there's some novelty to it in that, but the understanding of it was not, okay, we understand what being born is. So when Jesus said being born again, it wasn't that huge of it wasn't like something totally out of the blue. But here Jesus says living water. Living water is basically the terminology for moving water. And so, you go to Jerusalem, and there the pool of Siloam down at the south end of the city of David. That was a pool for cleansing, and the only reason it could be a pool for cleansing is because it was fed by living water. The Gihon spring fed it. So there was an inlet and there was an outlet. So there was a constant source of fresh water coming in. If it was just like the reflecting pool in D.C. that there's so much angst over right now, that there's really no inflow or outflow, it's just a stagnant body of water, that is different. And Jews only used living water, could only be ceremonially cleansed if they used living water, running water. There's archaeological evidence underneath the temple or in the temple complex in some of those ruins of, like, we would call them showers today, but it was water that was running, and it would flow out into these chambers where you could stand under it, and like they assume that was like for the priest, for people of celebrity, if you will, people that were well known or powerful that wanted to enter the temple, that they kind of had a private shower area where instead of being immersed, they could come in and they could be rinsed with living water and then go up into the temple. So the term living water just mainly speaks of water that's moving, water in a stream and a river that's flowing in some way rather than just being stagnant in there. So when Jesus says living water, that's in contrast to what's in the well. What's in the well is not living water because it's just sitting there. So they wouldn't have considered that living water. So Jesus kind of changes the terminology a little bit because he's going from physical to spiritual here. And so, verse 11, she's as confused as Nicodemus was. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? I mentioned that the well that there's a church built over that is believed to be the well of Jacob. It's over 200 feet deep. That's a very deep well for the time period because somebody had to dig that. That's a engineering disaster waiting to happen, especially with the technology they had at the time. But Jesus goes to the spiritual, and she doesn't come with him. Just like with Nicodemus. Jesus went to the spiritual, Nicodemus stayed behind. How can I go back into my mother's room a second time? Well, wait a minute, you don't have anything to draw with. And thinking completely in the physical realm. And so how do you have this living water if you have nothing to draw with? Verse 12, art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well? Well, yes, he is. And drank thereof himself and his children and his cattle. Well, what do you have that makes you greater than Jacob? Where does this living water come from? And you have something better up your sleeve than what Jacob left for us, is kind of what she's saying there. In verse 13, it says, Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water, the water in the well, shall thirst again. We know that's true because the women went to the well every single day. You've never had a glass of water that carried you through for the week. Okay? You get thirsty again. Verse 14, but, so there's a change, whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. Jesus is not talking about real water. He's talking about getting saved. He's using the terminology of water because he's at a well and he's talking to a woman who's got water on the mind. She doesn't have water on her brain, she has water on her mind, okay? There's a difference. One is a bad thing, the other is a good thing. She's got water on her mind because she's going to get water. She's thinking about filling her buckets and how much she can carry and how long of a walk it is back, and that's what she's thinking of. So Jesus takes what she's thinking about and uses it. And so he says, the water that I'm giving you, in contrast to this water, which would just make you thirst again, the water that I'm giving will be an everlastingly replenishment of water. The water that I give you turns itself into a spring of water that never dries up. And we know that eternal life, everlasting life, when we get saved, we know that it's eternal. It never dries up. You never have it and then don't have it. And once you have the living water, you have it forever. And that's what Jesus is saying. But he's speaking in a metaphor that she's not yet hooked up to. So verse 15, the woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. She's still in the physical realm. He's talking spiritually. He's not actually going to give her any H2O. He's going to give her eternal salvation if she would ask for it. She's still thinking, okay, well, that would be great. If I never had to come back to the well again, that would be amazing. I would like this water, this magic water that keeps me from having to come to the well. And so now Jesus can reel her in. Jesus saith unto her, Go, call thy husband and come hither. So now she needs to know who she's talking to. Okay? The message is one thing, but understanding who the messenger is a whole other thing. Okay? If Ozzy Osbourne started talking to you about Jesus, would you receive that message very much? Even if he was telling you the truth, it's like Ozzy Osbourne is not the receptacle here. If I want to know about Jesus, I want to know I'm talking to somebody who understands who Jesus is, right? So Nicodemus came to Jesus already understanding that. We know that you're a man sent from God, and you do these miracles, and you could only do them if God was with you. So Nicodemus came with an understanding that he's a good master, good rabbi. And so Nicodemus is coming to him with a certain level of humility and recognition that Jesus is doing something he can't do and that God is with him in a way he's not with him. So he's coming to Jesus with an understanding that Jesus is somehow superior to him. He just doesn't understand it yet. So he's coming to find out what that is. All right? This woman's talking to Jesus. She just thinks he's a nice Jewish guy who isn't bothered with the prejudice that the normal Jewish men have. And so she's willing to engage and talk with him, but she doesn't understand who he is. So now Jesus is going to convince her that she's not talking to an ordinary person. So he says, Go call thy husband. Which a woman of her age to be married would be a normal assumption. There weren't very many single women in her age group. We know she's been married and divorced 5 times, so let's assume that she had a couple of years with each husband. She's probably not even in her 20s. So Jesus makes the statement based on what she looked like. Any Jewish man, any man would assume a woman of that age was either widowed or married. That's because 99% of all the women were either widowed or married at that age. So go call thy husband. Not an unusual question. Verse 17, the woman answered and said, I have no husband. Well, we know that's a true statement. But it's not the whole truth. We oftentimes are willing to say things that are true so long as we don't have to say the rest of it that's true. But Jesus knows the rest of the story, and that's the point of the question, go call thy husband. And not really a question, but the instruction to go call thy husband is because he knows what she's going to say. I have no husband. So Jesus responds, you've well said, thou hast well said, I have no husband, for thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that sayest thou truly. He said, well, what you said is technically true because you're not married right now, but you've been married 5 times and you've been divorced 5 times, and now you're living with a guy, which is really a big deal. It's not a big deal in 2026. People do it all the time. In that day, it was a big deal. That was a shameful thing. Only the truly immoral, God-rejecting people lived that kind of a life. And so he was calling her out on that, and he said, so technically what you said is true. You answered in a very lawyerly way. You parsed it out. So now, how does he know this? So in verse 19, the woman saith unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Her first conclusion is not to, oh, he must be the Messiah, the chosen one of God. What are the odds of that? But the fact that he could know her the way he knew her, okay, well, I'm beginning to think you're a prophet, that you're somebody who speaks for God, which is what she needed to acknowledge before she could receive the message, that when he speaks, he's speaking for God, which is what a prophet did. Okay? So she's made the first big important step. She's not there yet, but she's in that direction. Okay? Is Jesus a prophet? Yes, because he spoke for God all the time. Everything that ever came out of his mouth, he was speaking for God because he is God. So in that, he was a prophet, okay? Verse 20, our fathers worshipped in this mountain. Now, she's pointing to the mountains of Samaria where Jeroboam, when the kingdom divided, built altars, put a golden calf there, and they worshiped Baal. And for hundreds of years, they worshiped Baal until the Assyrians carried them off into captivity when God finally had enough of their foolishness. So we've worshipped in that mountain. And ye say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Which actually was a true statement in that up until that time, where did God choose to put his name, put the temple, have the presence of God rest? It was there in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. It's an amazing place to go stand and realize that you're standing in the place that God had chosen to put his name, where millions of sacrifices were issued, where the presence of God literally rested on the temple. That was the place. And standing there on the Temple Mount, looking into the eastern sky over the Mount of Olives, I'm telling you, I felt like I could reach out and knock on the door of heaven. It was the weirdest sensation I've ever had, but that's just the way I felt standing up there. So, verse 21, Jesus is going to help her in her understanding of worship. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship, ye know not what. When you worship, you Samaritans, when you worship, you don't know what you're worshiping. You're not worshiping God. You've just kind of created your own God, and you worship him. And it says, we know what we worship. Jewish people at least know what we're worshiping. For salvation is of the Jews, meaning God has chosen the Jewish people, and that the faith of the Jewish people is the way of salvation. It's not the faith of the Gentiles, it's the faith of the Jewish people. Okay? And the faith of the Jewish people is the faith in what God had said. And they had the Old Testament. Understand, they only had the Old Testament. They were only responsible for the Old Testament in the Old Testament. They were not responsible for the New Testament teachings that hadn't come yet. God was only holding them accountable to put faith in what he had said to that point. And so that's what Jesus is saying. It's the worship of God in the limited instruction they had. It is faith in God that they were required to exercise. And that's where a relationship with God ultimately came from in this period of time. It came from doing what they were told to do in faith. Well, God said to do it, I'm just going to do it. I don't understand it, but I'm going to do it because that's what God said. And that is the same faith that carries over into the New Testament. Jesus, we're instructed that we have to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ to be saved. You don't have to understand it all. You just have to accept it. You have to receive it. You have to believe it. Your faith has to fill in what you can't see, that Jesus died and rose again. I can't show it to you. There's no security camera footage. There's not a news feed, archival video, or anything like that. All we have is what God said happened as our witness to that. And everybody who's saved in here tonight That was enough. Your faith took what God said and proved it, that what God said is true. That's what faith does. It proves something you can't see, you can't scientifically prove, but faith is the proof of what God has said to be true. So Jesus is correcting this a little, but now look what he says in verse 23. But the hour cometh and now is. So Jesus is saying, right now, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. So the hour will come and now is, and it still is today, where the true worship of God doesn't come through animal sacrifice. It doesn't come through the physical aspects of true worship doesn't take place with the tithes and offerings. It doesn't truly take place with the singing and all of that. The true worship takes place in the Spirit. Worship is a spiritual experience. It is not a physical experience. Okay? We worship him in two things, and both things have to be present for it to be true worship. One is spirit and the other is truth. We worship him in spirit, meaning I have to have a spiritual connection with God in order that in my spirit I can worship him. I can't worship him merely by, raising my hands, or merely by singing, or merely by putting money in the plate, or merely by bowing myself down. It's the spirit that God sees. It's the spirit that produces the worship. It is the position of the heart, a broken and contrite spirit, a heart in tune with the Lord. God has always been more interested in that, by the way. In the Old Testament, God rebuked the Jewish people. He said, "You bring your sacrifices, but I have no pleasure in them because your heart is far from me." God was always interested in the heart. It was always faith. The sacrifices never saved anybody. It was the faith that saved people. Always has, always will be. Salvation is by grace through faith. It was always by grace through faith in Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve. It will always be by grace through faith. It will never be in works, ever. Okay? Jesus is saying that worship is a spiritual experience. So somebody who's unsaved cannot truly worship God. They're dead spiritually. They haven't been quickened in their spirit, which happens at salvation. But not only is there the spirit involved in it, the internal attitude of the heart, but there is truth. You can't worship God however you want to. You have to worship God the way he told you to, even when you're worshiping in spirit. So the problem with churches today, a lot of churches today, is they've decided what they like for worship, and then they throw that slop up to God and ask him to accept it. And he's under no obligation to do that. And honestly, a lot of them, their spirit is right. They truly want to worship God. They truly are trying to please God. In reality, they're doing it in a way that they like. They haven't really found out what God likes. They just found out what they like. And that's why the music changes every couple of years. And we've got to always have these new songs. What's cool? What's hip? And how do we get all the mood lighting just right, and the fog machines and the lighting, and they're all on that external. There's some churches that are so carnal and so external that they couldn't worship God if they tried. There are other churches that sincerely are trying to worship God. They're just not doing it in truth. They're in error when they do it, and God is not going to accept that either. Truth is always a part of the equation. The Bible says of Jesus that he was full of two things. Does anybody know what Jesus was full of? Close. Truth is one of them. Starts with a G. Grace. He's full of grace and truth. You have churches today that are full of grace, but they don't have truth. They spend 45 minutes with their rock concert and their worship team that they've contracted out with. They're paying them to do this. And then the pastor gets up for 10 minutes and he shares something that's on his heart. Okay? There's a lot of grace there. They're accepting people. They welcome people in. They're gracious in a lot of ways. Do better at that than most churches do. And that's why they're so attractive, because they are very gracious, but they have no truth. They're using whatever Bible they feel like tomorrow. They use whatever music is the most attractive. I mean, they're not grounded in anything. They're just wandering doctrinally from thing to thing to thing. Okay? But then you go to the other extreme, and you have, especially in independent Baptist circles, you have a lot of churches that they're solid on truth. And they're about as gracious as a wood chipper. They have no graciousness at all. You walk into their church, and you're not dressed a certain way, and they're on you. You walk into their church, and you got a tattoo, and they're cover that up. There's no grace there. Did Jesus say anything to this woman about her lifestyle? He's just asking questions, Go call your husband. All right, well, you're right. You've had 5. He's just pointing out the facts because she needs to hear these things. But he didn't say, you disgusting woman. He didn't rush over and say, you need to get married. You're going to live with a guy, get married. Didn't do any of that stuff. And so there has to be a balance. And in Jesus' case, he's full of both grace and truth. And as a church, we should seek to have a good balance of grace and truth. We should be as gracious as we possibly can and never moving off the truth at all. That's what a good church is. And if you get either of those out of balance, you can have all the truth you want. If you don't have grace, you're not the Spirit of Christ. Your church is not governed by the Spirit of Christ. You can thump the King James Bible till you wear a hole down the middle of it, and it doesn't make you like Christ because you use a King James Bible and you have Baptist doctrine and you do all this kind of stuff and you say, bless God a lot. It does not make you close to God. If you want to be like Jesus, you have to be truthful, but you also have to be gracious in giving the truth. And so we got to find that balance in there. Here Jesus uses the Spirit and truth because truth, when you're in relationship with God, is always a part of the equation because he is truth. A lot of good doctrine in this conversation. Who knew you could cram so much good doctrine into a conversation with a woman who's on her 6th man? And notice he at the end of verse 23, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is looking for people to worship him. You just have to do it in spirit and truth. God's not trying to exclude anybody from worship. He's just saying, I want to include you, but this is the only way I can include you. Okay? We set down rules in our home. We want to include our children in the blessing, but this is the way you get the blessing. We can't give you blessings while you're in rebellion. We can't give you blessings when you're neglecting your family responsibilities. Here's the way you get that. We've got a society today that wants to not be responsible for their duties as a citizen, but they want all the privileges that go along with being a citizen. Okay? Rights always come with responsibilities. And so, that's why I'm not personally against restrictions on voting. I don't think everybody who's 18 and lives in America should vote. I think if you're dumb as a box of rocks, we shouldn't let you vote. I think if you're a criminal, we shouldn't let you vote. I think if you're a drug addict, we shouldn't let you vote. I think if you don't pay taxes, you shouldn't get to vote. You know why? Because if you're not fulfilling any responsibilities as a citizen, why should you enjoy any of the rights of it? That's a very biblical concept, by the way. I'm not being mean. That's just the way God operates. You want the privileges, you got to do the responsibilities. If you don't do the responsibilities, you don't get the privileges. To me, it's a very simple concept. But no, we want to be fair. We want to give every dummy who, can't name the Vice President of the United States the right to vote and choose our next congressman, senator, governor. That irritates me. My well-informed vote gets canceled out by somebody who can't spell vice president. Such is the burden of being in a free country. Verse 24, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. We're going to stop here. We'll have to come back to it and finish up chapter 4 next week, obviously, because I didn't even make it halfway through. God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Okay, God is not a man like you and I. God is a spirit. Now, God put on human flesh in the form of Jesus Christ. But that did not make God, that didn't bring God or reduce him down to a physical being. God still is a spiritual being. He is a spirit. And if you want to worship him, you have to worship him in spirit and in truth. Jesus statement twice indicating its importance. Repetition is God's volume control. So pay attention to that. It's spirit and in truth. And then the conversation will get more intense as the woman says, well, I know when Messiah comes. And then Jesus explains to her that I am that Messiah. I am he. And so they'll deepen that conversation. We'll look at the rest of that in the rest of chapter 4. It's an amazing finish to the story.